Interactive dialogue with the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua. As you already well know, speaking time is 1 minute 30 seconds for all speakers. And now let me give the floor to the delegation of Cyprus. Cyprus, you have the floor.
The statement delivered by the European Union.
Microphone, please. Microphone. Yeah, it's on.
Mr. President, Cyprus aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and thanks the experts for their report on the human rights situation in Nicaragua. While welcoming the release of 222 political prisoners on 9th of February 2023, we deplore the fact that they have been stripped of their civil rights. My delegation is deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the rule of law in the country and the worsening human rights situation, including extrajudicial killings, torture and arbitrary detentions. We call on the lifting of the severe restrictions on freedom of expression and association, resulting in an ever-shrinking civic space. Harassment and intimidation of critics, journalists and human rights defenders must cease. We urge the Nicaraguan government to fully comply with international human rights law. Towards this end, it is imperative for the government to engage with a group of human rights experts, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and other international human rights mechanisms. I thank you.
I thank you, Excellency. Now let me invite the delegation of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. DPRK delegation has a look at the report presented before us as a dangerous trend of interference in internal affairs of sovereign state based on unreliable and incredible sources in the activities of the UN human rights mechanism. It is obviously selective and politically motivated approach, and it proves itself that it is another attempt to manipulate the Human Rights Council in its own political interest. The main goal of this process is aimed at demonizing a legitimate sovereign state and changing its power ultimately. It is absolutely unacceptable. We continue to oppose and reject any practice and attempt of selective targeting of sovereign state and political interference in their internal affairs under the pretext of human rights. We note with appreciation the measures taken by the government of Nicaragua to strengthen its judicial and electoral system and its laws, as it centers on the dignity and protection of human rights of Nicaraguans and safeguard peace. We urge HRC or HRCR to encourage genuine dialogue and cooperation with the state, carry out work based on its mandate in an objective and impartial manner, and stand against politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. Let me now invite the delegation of Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Just last Friday, the Council held a forced dialogue against Nicaragua on the basis of an interventionist resolution that has nothing to do with true protection and promotion of human rights. Now it is time to look at a report from the new mechanism to bully Nicaragua, fabricated by that resolution. Just to give an example, it questions and suggests change of its national electoral system. This is a gross violation of sovereignty and of the respect due to non-interference in the internal affairs of states. The backdrop to this new offensive was the indisputable results of its municipal elections held in full peace and harmony in a civic celebration with full participation by the people. Keeping Nicaragua on the agenda of this council is part of a plan orchestrated in order to try to justify the imposition of the illegal, inhuman, unilateral coercive measures against Nicaragua, by which are true crimes against humanity. The government of Venezuela reaffirms its full support to the brotherly people of Nicaragua and its government, and will continue firmly to oppose politicization, selectivity and double standards in the work of this council. Thank you, President.
I thank you. Now let me pass the floor to the delegation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Madam, you have the floor.
Mr. President, we thank the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua for the presentation of their report. The reports of grave and systematic human rights violations, in particular the use of sexual and gender-based violence, are deeply disturbing. The UK supports the recommendations of the report and continue to call on the Nicaraguan government to cooperate fully with the group. The report raises concerns about the participation of the President, Vice President and officials, as well as non-state actors, in exceptionally serious and systematic human rights violations and abuses, including extrajudicial executions, torture, arbitrary deprivation of nationality, as well as violations of numerous fundamental freedoms. While we welcome the recent release of political prisoners from Nicaraguan jails, the decision by the authorities to expel them from Nicaragua and to strip them of their nationality and their assets is wholly unacceptable penalisation of exercising their rights. We would welcome the views of the experts on the effect of actions taken to date by the international community, in particular to discourage the Nicaraguan government to abstain from committing further violations, abuses and crimes, and crucially to hold those responsible to account. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite the delegation of Argentina. Ambassador, we have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Argentina thanks the group of experts for presenting its report in keeping with the resolution adopted by the Council with my country's favourable vote. We're concerned by the report on violations and human rights abuses in Nicaragua, including summary executions, arbitrary detention, torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment, arbitrary deprivation of nationality and violation of the right to stay in one's own country. The group finds reasonable motives to believe that these violations and human rights abuses were carried out in generalised systematic fashion for political motives, and these have been fully verified and make it possible to believe that these are crimes against humanity. Both the work of the Office of the High Commissioner and the group of experts contribute to the protection and promotion of human rights, and their respective mandates are complementary and mutually supporting. We call once more on the authorities of Nicaragua to make progress in an inclusive national dialogue and cooperate fully, allowing timely access to the country both by the Office of the High Commissioner and other monitoring mechanisms, including the group of experts, so that they can carry out their mandates fully. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Now we will continue with the video message delivered by Spain.
Señor Presidente.
President, we thank the group of experts for presenting the report and for the work done during this first year. The facts related in the report show the gravity of the human rights situation in Nicaragua and the erosion of the rule of law. The attacks on the independence of the judiciary, the prohibition and persecution of civil society, the criminalisation of political opposition figures, and the lack of free elections have created a climate of repression and a lack of civil and political freedoms and flagrant denial of democracy. We call on Nicaragua to fulfil international treaties that the country has ratified, to cooperate with the mechanisms for protection of human rights, including the work done by the Office of the High Commissioner and the group of experts, together with a dialogue with the opposition and civil society stakeholders in Nicaragua. Spain welcomes any measure that contributes to bringing Nicaragua back into the democratic fold and human rights. We would like to know in what fields we can help to continue supporting your work in Nicaragua, Mr. Simon.
Thank you. Now let me pass the floor to the delegation of Holy See.
Mr. President, it is with concern that we have read in the report of the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua about the deterioration of the socio-political and human rights situation in the country, with increased restrictions on freedoms of expression, of peaceful assembly and association, along with repressive measures against critics of the government, journalists and human rights defenders, as well as members of the Catholic Church. The reported closure of several independent media outlets and non-governmental organizations, including faith-based organizations, also cause concern. This delegation wishes, therefore, to echo the plea of Pope Francis to overcome hostilities and seek spaces for a constructive dialogue between the parties, laying the foundations for the return to a peaceful coexistence based on the respect of the dignity and rights of all persons, especially those in the most vulnerable situations who are disproportionately affected by the current circumstances. Pope Francis appeals for the opening of the hearts of political leaders and all citizens to the sincere search for peace, which is born of truth, justice, freedom, and love. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Grace. The delegation of Georgia is the next.
President, and I commend the group of experts for the report and efforts, especially considering the lack of access to Nicaragua. It is of an utmost importance to renew the mandate of the group in order to address all human rights violations and abuses reported. We find it very disturbing that the number of deaths which occurred during demonstrations of 2018 is considerably higher than acknowledged by the authorities. Furthermore, Georgia is alarmed with the findings of the report that violations and abuses perpetrated by those in control, led by Ortega and Murillo, have widespread and systematic manner, and they amount to the crimes against humanity. The report clearly shows that the situation in Nicaragua continues to further deteriorate. Therefore, we demand from those in control to immediately release arbitrarily detained, to cease politically motivated persecution, to undertake independent and transparent investigations of crimes, to hold all perpetrators accountable, and to implement measures in order to guarantee democratic principles and the rule of law. Georgia stands by the people of Nicaragua and reiterates its support to their efforts for achieving peaceful solution to the country's social-political crisis caused by the regime. I thank you.
I thank you. Now let me pass the floor to the delegation of Italy. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Distinguished experts, Italy aligns itself with the statement delivered by the European Union and expresses its deep concern about the ongoing authoritarian drift and the serious human rights violation in Nicaragua, as a sadly reported by the expert. Italy deplores the destruction of civic and democratic space, the widespread repression against political opponents, religious leaders, journalists and media, civil society and human rights defenders, including through sham trials, extrajudicial execution, arbitrary detention, torture, exile and deprivation of nationality. Italy urges the Nicaraguan government to restore the rule of law and to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of expression and freedom of religion or belief. Nicaragua must release unconditionally the political prisoners still in jail and to end targeting their families. Italy reiterates the call for the resumption of a genuine and constructive dialogue between government and civil society. Italy confirms its support for the work of the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights and for the renewal of the mandate of the group of experts. We call on Nicaragua to grant them collaboration and access to the country and to cooperate with the international and regional mechanism in view of the next Universal Periodical Review at the end of 2024.
Thank you. Chile is the next. Madam Ambassador, you have the floor.
Señor Presidente.
President, Chile thanks the group of experts for the report, which contains important information and recommendations to improve the human rights situation in Nicaragua. We reiterate our concern at the loss of democracy and the human rights violations in the report. It is particularly worrying to see the behaviours being repeated systematically in generalised fashion throughout the country. This is a policy driven by the highest state authorities to retain power and prevent opposition. We call on Nicaragua's authorities to renew international dialogue and constructive cooperation with the group of experts, with access to the country for that group and other human rights bodies. Chile will continue to stand with Nicaraguans in order to take measures that allow effective access to truth, justice and reparation, given the grave human rights violations taking place, and for progress back to democracy. Chile would like to ask the group of experts about the scope of their mandate, particularly whether there is a need to adjust it in terms of material and duration in order to allow them to carry out their functions better. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. We will continue with the delegation of Belarus.
Thank you, Mr. President. The report presented to Council today and the activity of the mechanism established without the agreement or the interest of Nicaragua are not an instrument for dialogue and cooperation in human rights. They merely create additional tension and confrontation, as the authors of the report were not able to overcome their bias and are not attempting to present an objective picture of the situation. Moreover, they appear to deliberately distort the processes in the country in order to reach unfounded recommendations and conclusions for further exacerbating the situation. This approach does not facilitate the seeking of new opportunities to restore trust and cooperation and leave the situation in a stalemate. The Human Rights Council should stop misusing country topics, the only purpose of which is to exert further pressure on states which select their own path for development. Thank you.
And now let me invite the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, President. Cuba is opposed and will continue to oppose the resolution that gave rise to this dialogue, which shows politicisation, selectivity and double standards that prevail in this Council. We must understand that only through dialogue, mutual respect and constructive cooperation can we contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights in all countries. President, we reiterate our unflagging support to the Sandinista government and the people of Nicaragua, who continue to work tirelessly for sustainable development, peace, justice, well-being and social emancipation. As we said last week, truly acting for human rights means demanding the immediate cancellation of the unilateral coercive measures against Nicaragua and other countries of the South whose effects are an obstacle to the full enjoyment of human rights of the peoples of the affected countries. We reiterate our strong opposition to politicization, imposition of punitive measures and unlawful use of the bodies and mechanisms of the United Nations to manipulate the internal situation in Nicaragua, destabilise its democratically elected government and damage its international image. Thank you.
I thank you. The Islamic Republic of Iran is the next. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Islamic Republic of Iran vehemently opposes the confrontational debate of the Council on developing countries, including on Nicaragua. The unfair approach towards Nicaragua, based on the unverified resources, signifies the negligence of relentless efforts undertaken by the government of Nicaragua in overcoming obstacles and challenges, mainly emanating from imposition of unilateral coercive measures that hurdle the enjoyment of people of Nicaragua from their fundamental human rights, in particular economic, cultural, and social rights. The effort and pattern of attacking a sovereign nation in the pretext of human rights irreparably damage the function and idea of the Council. We welcome the efforts undertaken by the government of Nicaragua in improving human rights of their people, especially for their achievements in improving the right to health, education and work. The will and steps taken by the government of Nicaragua in fighting extreme poverty and eradication of illiteracy are something that should be recognized and supported. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will continue with the delegation of Australia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the group of human rights experts in Nicaragua for their report. Australia is deeply concerned by the deterioration of human rights in Nicaragua and the continued dismantling of democratic institutions. Nicaragua has increasingly used repression of political opponents to maintain power. Human rights defenders, journalists and clergy are arrested, harassed and intimidated. Over 3,000 NGOs have been forced to shut down, with almost half of these since September last year. Australia notes the recent release of 222 political prisoners as a constructive step. However, we remain deeply troubled that their citizenship was stripped, leaving many stateless. We call for the immediate release of all individuals who have been arbitrarily detained and for the Nicaraguan authorities to respect their rights. We once again urge the Nicaraguan government to collaborate openly with human rights mechanisms, cooperate with the OHCHR, and allow opposition voices and NGOs to operate. We reiterate our commitment to the Nicaraguan people and ask how can the international community support accountability for reprisals taken against civil society actors, including those engaging with the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank you. And now let me invite the delegation of Ireland.
Ireland aligns with the statement of the European Union and thanks the group of human rights experts for the presentation of this first report. Ireland remains gravely concerned by the situation in Nicaragua and condemns the continued human rights violations, crackdowns on opposition voices, civil society, human rights defenders and independent media, and a severe backsliding on democratic norms. Ireland also deeply regrets Nicaragua's continued lack of cooperation with regional and international human rights mechanisms and calls on the authorities to re-engage with this council. While Ireland welcomed the recent release of 222 political prisoners from Nicaragua, we note that they should never have been detained. Ireland condemns the decision to strip them of their citizenship, an act inconsistent with Article 15 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We call on the authorities to reverse these arbitrary steps, to engage in dialogue and to take further action to the benefit of the Nicaraguan people. Ireland will continue working to support the people of Nicaragua in order to support a return to democratic norms and the protection of fundamental freedoms. Mr. Simon, the decision by the Nicaraguan authorities to deprive political opponents of their citizenship and civil and political rights is gravely concerning. Could you outline the consequences of this decision for the human rights situation in Nicaragua? Thank you.
Thank you. Delegation of Costa Rica, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Costa Rica welcomes the report and the work of the group of experts. The results are terrifying. Physical, psychological and sexual torture, summary executions, disappearances, threats against family members of victims. The international community must address the grave systematic violations and abuses of human rights that continue in Nicaragua. As the report shows, these may be crimes against humanity. The Council must address this situation, which continues to deteriorate and which has left thousands of people exiled, seeking asylum. Arbitrarily, in absolute contravention of international law, it has made hundreds of people stateless in clear violation of the right to nationality. Costa Rica calls on Nicaragua to cooperate fully with its international human rights obligations and to free the political prisoners and work with the group of experts. We call on the Council to renew the mandate of the group of experts in order to end impunity, achieve accountability and justice for all victims, including people of African descent, indigenous people, peasants, journalists, clergy and women and children. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me pass the floor to Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ukraine expresses its gratitude to the group of human rights experts for the report documenting serious and systematic human rights violations in Nicaragua. We reiterate our concern over the complete closure of the civil democratic space by the Nicaraguan authorities and strongly condemn the government's refusal to cooperate with international human rights mechanisms. We are particularly concerned that women and women's organizations have been specifically charged in relation for their participation in protests and their activities to demand justice. Extrajudicial executions, arbitrary detention, torture, violations of the right to participate in public affairs and the freedoms of expressions. This is not the full list of violations and abuses committed by the state of Nicaragua against its own people. Ukraine sees a strong correlation between internal oppression and disregard for international law by the Nicaraguan government. It was clearly demonstrated by the illegal opening of the so-called honorary consulate of Nicaragua in the temporarily occupied Autonomous Republic of Crimea in violation of Ukrainians' territorial integrity. We urge Nicaragua to comply with obligations under international human rights instruments and to take constrained steps to demonstrate its commitment to the rule of law, democracy and human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. The delegation of Russian Federation is the next. Sir, you have the floor.
President, the Russian Federation has consistently advocated for an objective and non-politicized work within the Human Rights Council. We do not support maintaining the mandate of the group of experts on Nicaragua. Their report is replete with accusatory rhetoric, and the alleged authenticity of evidence is based on vague phrases such as "there are reasonable grounds to believe." The authors disregard the adverse effect of unlawful sanctions introduced by the US, the UK and their satellites against Nicaragua. Moreover, we are astonished to see the recommendations of the expert to extend sanctions to organizations and individuals. Such declarations fully discredit this mechanism, which is already calling for the use of sanctions as a tool to coerce sovereign states and impose borrowed values on them. Critical attacks against Managua are to a large extent due to Washington, London's and aims, as well as those of their satellites, to reshape this country in their own interest as it conducts its independent policy. After the failed attempted coup in 2018, organized and sponsored from abroad, the Collective West is continuing its anti-Nicaragua campaign in the Human Rights Council, demonstratively disregarding the achievements of the lawful government of Nicaragua. The poverty level has fallen by 24 degrees, extreme poverty by 14 degrees. and we call upon to refrain from such politicized attempts.
Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. We thank the group of experts for the report. Panama, as a signatory to the Universal Declaration and the various conventions on statelessness, is concerned at the actions of the government of Nicaragua on human rights, particularly as regards the right to nationality and the situation of its citizens. We trust that the decisions adopted by the government of Nicaragua on citizenship and nationality affecting over 300 people can be resolved sustainably with cancellation of those measures in order to protect the rights of that group. The right to nationality is a basic human right. Panama believes that is considering all of the applications to our country in the light of the relevant conventions. We call on the government of Nicaragua to ensure the full respect of the right to persons to have a nationality in keeping with international treaties to which it is party. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me invite the delegation of Brazil. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Brazilian government follows the events in Nicaragua with utmost attention and is concerned with the reports of serious human rights violations and restrictions on democratic space in that country. In particular, summary executions, arbitrary detentions, and torture against political dissidents. Brazil stands ready to explore ways in which this situation can be constructively addressed in dialogue with the government of Nicaragua and all relevant actors. The Brazilian government also received with extreme concern the decision of Nicaraguan authorities to determine the loss of nationality of more than 300 Nicaraguan citizens. By reaffirming its humanitarian commitment to the protection of stateless persons and to the reduction of statelessness, the Brazilian government makes itself available to welcome the people affected by this decision under the special statute provided for in the Brazilian migration law. I thank you.
I thank you, Excellency. The next speaker is Eritrea. Eritrea, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Eritrea respects the right of developing countries to independently determine their own future and destiny. We demand that the Council stops the recycling of reports to disparage societies who have decided to take their future into their own hands. We have always advocated that all parties conduct constructive dialogue on human rights issues on the basis of equality and mutual respect, and with ultimate objective of safeguarding human rights and fundamental freedoms. Contrary to that, we are witnessing these days the increasing tendency to establish counterproductive special mandates leading to confrontation and division among member states on the vision on how best could the Council deliver its lofty objectives. The fact that this Council considers the same issue in Nicaragua in this very same session by itself testifies to the lack of sincerity and objectivity to serving human rights. And we call on the Council to cooperate fully and to understand each other. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And now let me invite the delegation of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Gracias, presidente. Reiteramos nuestro rechazo a las decisiones que van contra países que son una injerencia en sin tener en
consideration specificities that are cultural and national.
Por otro lado, la resolución 49 se tomó de forma no consensuada. No, ¿ves?
Without taking into consideration the interest of the state. We welcome Nicaragua's efforts to promote human rights and to establish judiciary legislation and an electoral system, as well as other measures taken in Nicaragua to fight against the coercive unilateral measures and the
para poder
embargo,
gozar de sus
which prevents
derechos,
millions
de
from
sus derechos
enjoying
fundamentales a la
their fundamental rights, such as
educación y a la
the
salud.
education and others. Thank you.
Thank you. And now let me invite the delegation of Paraguay. Paraguay, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. We thank the group of experts for the report. Paraguay is very concerned at the results of this report. These show grave systematic violations and abuses of human rights. And these could, according to the group of experts, be crimes against humanity. We urge the government of Nicaragua to stop the political persecution, including the arbitrary deprivation of nationality and the forced exile, including freeing the persons arbitrarily detained as the state persons rendered stateless. This is a serious violation of basic rights. It is unacceptable in these times, and it shows that there is a multidimensional crisis in Nicaragua, which must be addressed by all measures and, of course, preferably through dialogue. We call on Nicaragua to work not only with the mechanisms of the universal system, but also with the regional human rights system, which also does not have access. As states, we are committed to implement this in order to move towards fairer societies. Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. Now, my understanding is that the Secretariat received a late request for the floor from the delegation of China. So let me ask the Council if there are any objections to that. I see none. Therefore, China, you have the floor.
Mr. President, China respects Nicaragua's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity, respects its people's right to independently determine their own future and destiny, and resolutely opposes external forces interfering in its internal affairs under the pretext of democracy and human rights. The UCMs imposed by certain countries on Nicaragua are a manifestation of power politics and coercive diplomacy, seriously hindering economic and social development of the country and gravely violating the human rights of its people. Such measures should thus be lifted immediately. The Council should observe the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, adhere to the principles of objectivity and non-selectivity, actively conduct constructive dialogue, and provide no stage for hegemonic and dominion acts, confrontation, and pressuring. The International Committee should, with the consent of the government and its people, do more things that contribute to economic development and improvement of people's livelihood in a bid to truly advance the human rights cause in Nicaragua. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. And since we've finished the list of members and observers wishing to speak, we will continue with the national human rights institutions and civil society organizations. And let me pass the floor to the Bright Livelihood Award Foundation. You have the floor.
Regrets that no consideration could be made on the specific violations targeting indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants. Every day, indigenous communities on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua are faced by grave threats to their existence due to the presence of illegal settlers in their protected lands. While many are already forcibly displaced due to the intimidations and forced seizures, those who stay live in constant fear of armed attacks and lose access to their livelihood sources. Instead of investigating crimes, applying its legislation and implementing the precautionary measures of the Inter-American Court, the government has been actively promoting cohabitation with the settlers and is using various strategies to manipulate members of the communities into leasing or selling their lands, in complete breach of Law 28 of the Statute of Autonomy. While perpetrators enjoy impunity, indigenous rights defenders are subject to systematic violence, and the organizations that document abuses in the territories are shut down by the authorities. Mr. President, if the Council does not step up its efforts, who will soon be left to document the atrocities committed against indigenous communities, demand that the law be applied, and prevent an ethnocide in the Caribbean coast? The group of experts is essential in ensuring that justice can one day be a reality in Nicaragua. Nevertheless, indigenous communities cannot stay in the shadow. We therefore urge the Council to expand its mandate to specifically address violations affecting indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. Accountability must be provided. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we will continue with the video intervention by Aula Alberta.
Soy Lester Alemán.
I'm Lester Alemán, and I have to give this presentation by video because the government of Nicaragua has stripped me of my Nicaraguan nationality. I was recently taken from jail and removed from my country. I spent 583 days in jail and my human rights were violated because I'm a young Nicaraguan academic who has criticized the severe human rights violations by the government of Nicaragua. I speak on behalf of Aula Abierta and Alianza Universitaria Nicaraguense. We have documented the repression against young Nicaraguan academics who have been the target of systematic attacks by the state of Nicaragua in order to stop them participating in public affairs. This has consisted of killings, jailings, exile, and other severe human rights violations. None of these acts have been punished, and so the perpetrators continue to enjoy impunity. There continue to be reprisals for using the right to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and academic freedom in higher education. All of these arbitrary acts have meant that thousands of young people have had to drop their studies. We call on the state of Nicaragua to be made to the following: one, to stop the attacks on academics; two, investigation and punishment of the grave violations of human rights; and three, measures implemented to guarantee justice, truth, reparation, and non-recurrence. Thank you.
Thank you. And we will continue with Réseau International des Droits Humains.
Distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, I'm Becky McCrae-Urbina, a Rama indigenous person, Nicaraguan, and lawyer. I speak for two NGOs that wish to express concern at this serious situation in our country with structural violation and violation of the rights of the original peoples. Armed settlers are coming into our territories with the complicity of the state, which has taken no measures to guarantee protection of our territories and our peoples. This has led to killings of at least 67 indigenous people with impunity and the pillaging of territories, which affects our way of life and our food security, forcing us to move and live in precarious conditions. These are clear crimes against humanity. The continuing violations of our collective rights also affect the environment. Indiscriminate exploitation of the resources because of mining, forestry, and cattle rearing have led to environmental damage and deterioration of the lands of the various natural reserves. We call for investigation, and we believe it is essential that the group can be able to continue its mandate.
The time limit, 1 minute and 30 seconds, applies for all. And now let me give the floor to the International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. On behalf of my organization, I thank the group for the report. We see the crimes against humanity, the most serious in the hierarchy of international law. These may not remain unpunished. However, this is not just in the past. The repression continues and spirals with the terrible decision to strip of nationality over 300 Nicaraguans, including members of our organization and persons who have been arbitrarily held incommunicado, and we call for the security of these persons to be protected. These acts are an affront to the international community, which is committed to protecting human rights and upholding the rule of law. We call on the Council to renew and broaden the resolution and the mandate of the group of experts so that they may document these violations and establish accountability. We call on the Council and the Member States to ensure that all political prisoners in Nicaragua are freed. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me invite the representative of Freedom House.
Buenos días.
Good morning. I'm Josefa Meza. I'm the mother of Jonathan Morazan, a 21-year-old university student who was murdered at the hands of the Nicaraguan state on 30th of May 2018 while he was participating in a peaceful demonstration in Managua to demand democracy, justice and freedom in Nicaragua. Across the country, 19 persons were killed on May the 30th, which is Mother's Day in Nicaragua. The murder of children was the gift that the Nicaraguan authorities gave to mothers. 5 years later, the murder of my son remains unpunished, just like the murder of 354 other people in 2018. I call on this Council and the High Commissioner to support us as we seek justice in the face of these killings sponsored by the Nicaraguan government against students and peaceful activists. I ask you that together with the people of Nicaragua prevent more deaths, advocate for the release of the 35 political prisoners who are still unjustly imprisoned, and continue clarifying the crimes committed by extending the mandate of the group of experts on human rights in Nicaragua. Democracy cannot be built on impunity. The Nicaraguan people demand truth, justice and reparations. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next speaker is from International Service for Human Rights. You have the floor.
Mi nombre es Alexandra.
I'm Alexandra Salazar. Together with the International Service for Human Rights, we recognize the efforts in the investigations by the group of experts. This has made it possible to observe the human rights violations generalized against an entire population, and particularly against opposition figures or those perceived as such. This shows the reality that we're living. A dictatorial police state which lives on fear and absolute deprivation of human rights, instrumentalization of state institutions for repressive politics.
A point of order on behalf of Nicaragua. Nicaragua, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you, President. I regret because there is exceptional work being undertaken here, but we have to bring a point of order because the speaker is not using adequate language to speak of the government of Nicaragua. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I call upon all speakers to uphold UN standards when referring to countries. And I see another point of order. United States. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Without addressing the substance of the speaker's statement, we are of the opinion that what we have heard of the intervention so far is indeed addressed to the subject matter at hand before this Council and is within the UN rules in terms of the IB package. Mr. President, we respectfully ask you to allow the speaker to be allowed to finish her presentation.
Thank you. I'm going to give the floor back to the speaker, but reminding again all the delegations to use the UN standards and language which is appropriate to the HRC Council. Thank you. You have the floor.
Thank you. This shows that all levels of the state, including Daniel Terga and Rosario Murillo, participated in executions, jailings, torture, persecution and other crimes. The repression continues as we see from new detentions following the enforced deportation and stripping of nationality of 317 people. There are still 37 people arbitrarily detained in jail. They have unfounded charges against them. And they continue not to have access to health care or to their families or effective remedies. We urge that the investigation of these crimes against humanity continue in order that there may be justice for all victims. We need to see a strengthening and renewal for 2 years of the mandate of the group of experts. Thank you.
Thank you. Now let me invite Center for Justice and International Law. You have the floor.
Wendy Flores.
I'm Wendy Flores, human rights defender from Nicaragua. We note with satisfaction the report by the group of experts, which shows the grave systematic human rights violations and the crimes against humanity, which are continuing in impunity, displacing about 500,000 Nicaraguans and leaving those who remain in the country in a desperate situation, as well as those of us outside the country without the possibility of obtaining justice. It is vital to strengthen the investigations, to identify the responsibilities of the perpetrators, as well as raising awareness of the types of repression, including limitation of the right to defence, due process and judicial guarantees in the context of arbitrary stripping of nationality of 316 persons, including 222 who were forced into exile. We therefore call for the group of experts to have its mandate extended and call for a consolidation of the experts into the torture and other crimes against humanity, including the situation of the indigenous and peasant communities and the interconnection of extractive enterprises and third parties in weakening democracy. We call for states to take up the recommendations of the group of experts and carry out actions to seek justice for victims, implement protection measures when they come to their countries, in order to ensure that their rights may be upheld. Thank you.
The Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Mr. President. CSW thanks the group of experts for their report and important work. Over the past year, the Nicaraguan government has taken draconian measures to eliminate independent voices in the country. Hundreds of members of the political opposition, human rights defenders, independent journalists and religious leaders have been arbitrarily detained and expelled from the country and stripped of their citizenship in contravention with international law. One political prisoner who refused to leave the country, Bishop Ronaldo Alvarez Lagos, was transferred from house arrest to maximum security prison and was sentenced to 26 years in prison in a summary trial the following day. He is currently being held in a punishment cell in La Modelo prison with almost no light. Most recently, the government has announced that religious activities, including traditional Roman Catholic processions carried out as part of the observance of Lent and Easter, will not be permitted, and all such activities must be confined within church buildings and limited hours set by the police. CSW calls on the Nicaraguan government to release all political prisoners, including Bishop Alvarez Lagos, and to restore the Nicaraguan citizenship to all those in and outside the country for whom it's been arbitrarily and illegally removed, to reinstate the legal status of all civil society organizations which have been arbitrarily made illegal, and to ensure that the fundamental human rights, including the freedom of religion or belief, for all are upheld in line with international law and the Pact of San Jose. We urge the international community to support Nicaragua in implementing these recommendations. Thank you.
I thank you. And now let me invite a representative of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Mr. President. We welcome the report of the group of human rights experts on Nicaragua, which highlights the severity of the human rights crisis in the country and reaffirms the need for robust international scrutiny. The report finds reasonable grounds to conclude that Nicaragua authorities committed widespread human rights violations that amount to crimes against humanity, including murder, imprisonment, torture, sexual violence, deportation, and politically motivated persecution. It also finds that abuses are the product of the deliberate dismantling of democratic institutions and destruction of civic and democratic space. High-level authorities were accused of having used the judicial and electoral branches of power to implement a legal framework aimed at repressing the exercise of fundamental freedoms, aiming at eliminating any opposition in the country. These findings are consistent with reporting by Human Rights Watch and other groups. In a situation that continues to worsen, international attention is direly needed. In February, the government stripped 317 critics of their nationality and confiscated their assets. 37 people remain arbitrarily detained. Since the government expelled staff members of the Inter-American Commission and OHCHR in late 2018, no international human rights monitor has been allowed to access the country. Faced with the government's repeated refusal to cooperate with international human rights bodies, we urge the Council to renew the mandates of the group of experts and OHCHR for 2 years to enable them to effectively continue monitoring and documenting Nicaraguan government abuses. I thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker I would be able to accommodate for this dialogue is Civicus. Civicus, you have the floor.
Nos llena de satisfacción la liberación de dos.
Thank you. We welcome the release of 222 political prisoners, but a Lombard decision to banish them and strip them, and 95 other government critics of citizenship and confiscate their assets. I'm one of the 317 who are now stateless. Let us not forget the 38 political prisoners still arbitrarily detained by the government, including Monsignor Rolando Alvarez. The status of civil space in the country is dire and getting worse because of the government's concerted effort to stifle all dissenting opinion. Since early 2022, it has cancelled the legal status of over 3,200 NGOs, which is 45% of those that existed before the crisis. The situation is worsened by the government's complete refusal to cooperate and engage with international human rights bodies. The many recommendations received by the government have been ignored, and the mandate of the group is more important than ever to make recommendations for necessary action. We urge the Council to renew the mandate of the group of experts for 2 years and extend the mandate of the Office of the High Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have some 10 minutes for concluding remarks, so let me give the floor back to Madam Angela Maria Buitrago. Madam, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. There was a question by France yesterday about our hopes in terms of freeing those arbitrarily detained. We believe that the judicial system needs to return to independence, and the arbitrary detentions cannot continue. The inexistence of evidence is unacceptable. There is irreparable damage occurring, and this is a society which needs a return to fairness. On Switzerland's question as to how to ensure that students and young people affected by this situation are not obliged into exile, we have to recognize them as stakeholders in the future of Nicaragua. And this means a need for dialogue and recognition of difference. States must also support education in Nicaragua so that there may be cooperation and recognition of the right to education regardless of political beliefs. Education is a human right.
Excelencias, resumo en una sola respuesta.
I would like to reply to various countries regarding our mandate and working conditions. Firstly, we respectfully call on the international community to renew our mandate, which ends this month. Given the current situation in Nicaragua, it would be reasonable to extend our mandate for 2 years. And given the trends in terms of human rights violations and crimes in Nicaragua, it would also be reasonable, in addition to presenting written reports, to call on the group to provide updates, oral updates periodically, on the question of the crimes being committed and the impunity for the purpose of accountability and justice for victims. Secondly, a renewed mandate needs to be supported by the necessary resources so that the task may be carried out properly. We currently have the smallest secretariat compared to other similar mechanisms, and that limits our scope, which is one of the broadest. Therefore, firstly, we need effective provision of the resources allocated. Secondly, we need to strengthen them in order that may carry out the investigations under our mandate, which is very broad. Thus, we need analysts and specific technological tools. This is not reflected in the current PBIs and the terms of reference. And thirdly, the results of our investigation show that the mandate needs to look further into fundamental aspects of investigation cooperation, which was not foreseen in the resolution and PBIs last year, despite the breadth of our mandate. In particular, there are 3 aspects. Firstly, instrumentalization of the state power and confiscation of assets. Secondly, support to victims getting access to justice. Thirdly, aspects related to indigenous Afro and peasant communities. In order to investigate these aspects, we need at least 3 additional specialists, and that needs to be reflected in the PBIs. As regards Chile's specific question, if we adjust the mandate of the group, we believe that adjustments are not necessary, but that is also taking into account the breadth of our mandate. But we do emphasize that what we need is an increase in resources, and thus the PBIs need to be improved.
Iceland and on behalf of a group of countries and on Australia to steps to urge Nicaragua to end impunity and guarantee accountability. Aside from the jurisdiction of states linked by the nationality of the victims, initiatives by third countries to promote access to justice for victims are particularly relevant here. Crimes against humanity are crimes against the international order. They empower the jurisdiction of states other than the state of the crime scene or whose citizens have been victimized. They constitute grounds for jurisdiction which do not require the link of citizenship. Countries of the international community that have recognized this ground of jurisdiction in their domestic legislations are equipped with the necessary tools to ensure that these atrocious crimes in Nicaragua do not go unpunished and that justice is done to the victims, provided that they have a legal standing in court. A recent case in point here from the Latin American region is the decision taken by the judicial authorities in Argentina to consider extending the jurisdiction to crimes against humanity in Nicaragua. In addition to third country initiatives to promote access to justice for victims, maybe a reminder to the current authorities in Nicaragua could persuade. The reminder is that the lack of ratification of the ICC statute does not exclude the possibility of the ex post facto referral to the situation of the ICC by any future government in Nicaragua. To the question of Ireland regarding the consequence of the deprivation of Nicaraguan citizens from their nationality, these are deeply concerning issues, stripping them not only from the right of nationality, but with a grave impact on a series of other rights, in particular the right to property, as we have heard, and not to be subjected to arbitrary interference with the family. The last one is with regard to the latest development in Nicaragua, where the government has decided to strip family members of those that were stripped of their nationality from their family names.